Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Have you ever felt the world stop? Your mind goes blank, the lights are too bright, and suddenly you forget everything. Public failure is one of our biggest fears, but it's also one of our greatest teachers. Today, we're going on a journey through 10 chapters of a story about falling down and finding the words to get back up. As we follow this story, you're going to learn real-life English vocabulary for stress, resilience, and recovery. We'll look at idioms like to bite the bullet and to save face in the context of a real-life struggle. This is a story for those who have ever failed but refuse to stay down. Let's begin. The air behind the heavy velvet curtain was thick with the smell of old dust and floor wax. For Julian, it felt like standing in the lungs of a giant. Somewhere on the other side of that red fabric, 800 people were finding their seats. The low hum of their conversations sounded like a hive of bees, a constant vibration that Julian felt in the soles of his dress shoes. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, not a violent shake, but a fine electric tremor that made the remote control for his presentation feel slippery. He tucked it into his pocket and wiped his palms on his trousers for the 10th time in 5 minutes. "You're up in 2, Julian," a voice whispered. It was Sarah, the stage manager. She wore a headset and carried a glowing tablet, her face illuminated by a pale blue light. She didn't look nervous. To her, this was just Tuesday. To Julian, this was the culmination of 3 years of design work. This presentation wasn't just a speech, it was his chance to finally prove his firm could handle a major city contract. If he nailed this, his career would reach a new level. If he stumbled, well, he didn't want to think about the alternative. He took a deep breath, trying to follow the advice of his mentor. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 8. But his lungs felt tight, as if he were wearing a suit 2 sizes too small. He looked at the monitor in the wings. His first slide was already loaded, a bold 3D render of a glass and wood library. It looked so certain, so confident. He wished he felt the same way. The moderator on stage began the introduction. Our next guest has spent years rethinking how we use public spaces. Julian felt a sudden, sharp urge to turn around and walk out the back door into the cool night air. He could just disappear. But then Sarah tapped his shoulder and gave him a small, professional smile. "Break a leg," she whispered. The applause started, a wave of sound that crashed against the curtain. The fabric parted, revealing a blinding wall of white light. Julian stepped forward, leaving the safety of the shadows, and walked toward the center of the stage. The heat of the stage lights was the first thing Julian noticed. It wasn't a gentle warmth, it was a heavy medicinal glare that made the edges of his vision blur. As the applause died down, the silence that replaced it was deafening. 800 people were waiting for him to speak. Julian reached the mahogany lectern and placed his trembling hands on the smooth wood. He looked out into the crowd, but because of the spotlights, the audience was just a sea of dark silhouettes. He felt like he was talking to a wall of ghosts. "Good evening," Julian began. His voice sounded thin and tiny in the massive hall. I want to talk to you about the heart of our city. The new community center is more than just wood and glass." He clicked the remote. The slide changed to a beautiful blueprint of the atrium. This was the moment he had practiced 1,000 times in his living room. He was supposed to explain the sustainable cooling system. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked at the screen. The lines of the drawing suddenly looked like a foreign language. He looked back at his notes, but the letters seemed to be dancing on the page, blurring into gray smudges.
A cold drop of sweat rolled down his spine. 5 seconds passed, then 10. In a large room, 10 seconds of silence feels like an hour. Julian heard someone in the front row cough. He heard the hum of the cooling fans in the projector. He tried to swallow, but his throat was as dry as sandpaper. He was drawing a blank. The system uses, he managed to whisper. He looked at the audience, pleading with his eyes for someone to help him, but the ghosts in the seats remained silent. He clicked the remote again, hoping the next slide would save him, but he skipped 2 slides by mistake. Now a complex financial chart was on the screen, completely out of order. Julian felt a wave of nausea. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he wasn't going to find the words. The bridge between his brain and his mouth had collapsed. He stood there, frozen in the white light, as the first murmurs of confusion began to ripple through the crowd.
The silence in the auditorium was no longer empty. It was heavy with the collective awkwardness of 800 people. Julian could feel their pity, and it was worse than their judgment. He looked down at the mahogany lectern, his fingers still gripping the edges so hard his knuckles were white. He had officially hit a wall. I'm sorry, Julian whispered into the microphone. The words echoed, sounding hollow and defeated. I apologize. He didn't wait for the moderator to respond. He didn't look back at the slides of his beautiful community center. He turned away from the bright spotlights and began the long walk toward the side of the stage. Every step felt like he was walking through deep water. The distance from the center of the stage to the heavy red curtains, which had felt so short minutes ago, now seemed like a mile. As he reached the wings, the darkness of the backstage area swallowed him. Sarah, the stage manager, was standing there. Her professional smile was gone, replaced by a genuine concern. She reached out a hand to touch his arm, but Julian flinched. He couldn't handle sympathy right now. "Julian, do you want a glass of—" "I have to go," he interrupted, his voice cracking. He didn't wait for the dressing room to collect his coat. He kept walking, past the technical crews and the stacks of equipment, toward the stage door. He pushed the heavy metal bar, and the cool night air hit his face like a slap. He stumbled out into the alleyway, the sound of the city's traffic muffled and distant. Behind him, he could hear the muffled sound of the moderator trying to smooth things over with the audience. "We seem to be having some technical difficulties. We'll take a short break." Julian leaned his forehead against the cold brick wall of the theater. He felt a wave of hot shame wash over him. He had spent months preparing for those 15 minutes, and he had thrown it all away in less than 60 seconds. He wasn't just an architect who had forgotten his lines. In his mind, he was now the man who froze. He reached into his pocket and felt the remote control he had forgotten to hand back. It felt like a heavy, useless stone. Julian sat on the edge of his bed, the room lit only by the pale blue glow of his smartphone. It was 2 a.m., but sleep was a distant memory. He knew he should turn a blind eye to the internet, but the temptation was too strong. He tapped the screen, and the nightmare began to play again. There it was, a shaky, handheld video uploaded to a local news site. The title read, "Local Architect's Presentation Ends in Awkward Silence." He watched himself on the small screen. From this angle, he looked even smaller than he felt. He saw the way his eyes darted around the room and the way he gripped the lectern. He looked like a deer in the headlights. The video ended just as he started his long walk down, but the comment section was just beginning. "Ouch, that was painful to watch," one user wrote. "Is this the guy designing our new library? I hope his buildings don't collapse like his speech," said another.
Each word felt like a physical blow. Julian was trapped in an echo chamber of his own making. He refreshed the page, looking for one person to defend him, but the internet wasn't in a forgiving mood. He felt like his entire reputation, built over years of hard work, had disappeared in a single viral moment. His phone buzzed in his hand, a text from his boss. "Julian, call me first thing in the morning. We need to talk about the city contract." He dropped the phone onto the carpet. The silence of his apartment felt different now. It wasn't peaceful, it was lonely. He realized that the public part of a public failure never really ends. Even when you are alone in your room, the echoes of the audience's confusion and the internet's mockery follow you. He walked to the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, the community center project was moving on without him. He felt like a ghost watching his own life happen from a distance. He had to decide, would he let these comments define him, or would he find a way to face the music? For the next week, Julian became an expert at disappearing. He traded his tailored office shirts for an oversized gray hoodie and kept the hood pulled low over his eyes. He stopped going to his favorite coffee shop, the one where the baristas knew his name and his order. Instead, he walked 3 blocks further to a crowded station cafe where the staff was too busy to look him in the eye. He spent his days wandering through the city. The sound of the city was a chaotic symphony, the screech of subway brakes, the distant rhythm of jackhammers, and the constant murmur of thousands of strangers. To Julian, this noise was a shield. In a crowd of millions, he hoped he was just another face, a blurry figure in the background of someone else's life. However, the fear of being recognized followed him like a shadow. Every time he saw someone pointing a smartphone in his direction, he felt a cold spike of anxiety. Are they taking a photo of the stage failure guy? He wondered. Every time he heard a group of people laughing, he assumed they were laughing at him. He was walking on eggshells, even though he was completely alone. One afternoon, he found himself standing in front of the construction site where the new library was supposed to be built. The ground was already broken, and a large sign displayed a 3D render of the project. His name had been removed from the bottom of the sign. He sat on a park bench across the street, watching the workers move like ants. A young woman sat on the other end of the bench, reading a newspaper. For a moment, Julian panicked, waiting for her to look up and gasp, "Hey, aren't you the guy from the video?" But she didn't. She simply turned the page, adjusted her glasses, and kept reading. The world was moving on. The city didn't care about his 15 minutes of silence. It was a harsh realization, but also a strangely liberating one. He wasn't the center of the universe, not even the center of his own failure. He realized he couldn't spend the rest of his life lying low. The city was loud, and eventually he would have to find his own voice to add back to the noise.
Julian's apartment had become a gallery of unfinished thoughts. Sketches were pinned to the walls, and his laptop sat on the kitchen table, its screen dark. For days, he had avoided opening the presentation file. It felt like a crime scene he wasn't ready to revisit. But on a rainy Tuesday morning, Julian finally sat down and clicked open. He didn't watch the video of himself this time. Instead, he looked at his notes. He began unpacking the pieces of that night, trying to find the exact moment the gears had jammed. He realized that he had spent months memorizing words, but he hadn't spent any time thinking about the what-ifs. He had prepared for a perfect performance, leaving no room for a human mistake. When he tripped over that first sentence, he didn't have a backup plan. He had put so much pressure on himself to save his career that his brain had simply shut down to protect him from the stress. He had been burning the candle at both ends for months, and the stage was simply the place where the wax finally ran out. He reached for a yellow legal pad and drew a line down the middle. On one side he wrote, "What I lost." On the other, what I kept. Under what I lost, he wrote the city contract and my pride. Under what I kept, he hesitated. Then he wrote the design. The failure on stage didn't change the fact that his blueprints were good. The silence in the room didn't make his sustainable cooling system any less efficient. He had confused his ability to speak with his ability to create. His phone rang. It was Marcus, an old colleague from his university days, who now ran a small, independent firm. Marcus almost let it go to voicemail, but he stopped. He couldn't keep everyone at arm's length forever. "Julian," Marcus said, his voice warm and steady, "I saw the news. I'm not calling to talk about the stage. I'm calling because I need a pair of eyes on a project in the Highlands. Are you ready to get back to work, or are you still licking your wounds?" Julian looked at his sketches. "I'm tired of licking my wounds, Marcus." The coffee shop was humming with the sound of steam wands and morning chatter. Julian sat in a corner booth, his hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug. He was waiting for Marcus. It was his first public meeting since the collapse, and every time the door opened, Julian felt a sharp pang of anxiety. When Marcus finally arrived, he didn't offer a look of pity or a dramatic hug. He just sat down, set a thick roll of blueprints on the table, and signaled the waiter. "You look like you haven't slept in a month," Marcus said bluntly. "It's been a long week." "I feel like there's an elephant in the room, Marcus. Everyone knows. Every time I see a colleague, they look at me like I've just survived a shipwreck." "That's because you did," Marcus replied, taking a sip of his black coffee. "But a shipwreck doesn't mean you aren't a sailor. It just means you hit a rock. The problem is you're letting the small talk kill you. You're waiting for people to bring it up so you can apologize." I realized my friend was right. He had been bracing himself for the awkward questions. "How are you holding up?" or "What happened up there?" He was so worried about saving face that he had forgotten how to just be a professional. "I lost the city contract," Julian said, his voice steady. "They called me on Friday. It's over." "The city is one client, Julian. A big one, sure, but they aren't the only ones who need a roof over their heads." Marcus unrolled the blueprints. "Look at this. It's a community library in the Highlands. It's small, quiet, and they don't care about viral videos. They care about timber and light. They need someone who understands how a building breathes." For the next hour, they didn't talk about the stage. They talked about load-bearing walls and glass insulation. Julian found that as they dove into the technical details, the barrier began to crumble. He wasn't the failure anymore. He was a designer again. He was back in the swing of things, at least for a moment. As he left the cafe, Julian realized that the only way to get past the small talk was to give people something else to talk about. The project in the Highlands was different. It wasn't a sleek city skyscraper or a high-tech community center. It was a library for a small town, and the budget was tight. Most importantly, there were no stage lights. Julian spent his mornings on site, wearing rugged boots and a windbreaker. Instead of standing behind a mahogany lectern, he stood on uneven dirt, holding his blueprints against the hood of a pickup truck. His audience was a group of 3 local contractors and a librarian named Mrs. Gable. At first, Julian struggled. He found himself over-preparing, writing out exactly what he wanted to say in a small notebook. He was terrified of losing his train of thought again. He spoke in stiff, formal sentences, trying to sound like the expert he thought he needed to be. "The structural integrity of the timber frame is optimized for," Julian began one morning, his voice tightening. Marcus, who was standing nearby, leaned over. "Julian, stop. Look at them. They don't need a lecture. They just want to know if the roof will leak when it snows." Julian took a breath. He looked at the contractors. Their faces weren't silhouettes in the dark. They were weathered, honest, and curious. He closed his notebook. "The wood we're using," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, "is local larch. It's tough. It handles the damp air here better than steel. It's like the people in this town. It's built to last." He wasn't performing anymore. He was talking. He found a new rhythm in his speech, one that allowed for pauses, for ums and ahs, and for questions. He started using simpler words, focusing on the why rather than the how. By the end of the week, he wasn't just the architect, he was part of the team. He was finding his feet again. He realized that the silence on the big stage hadn't been a lack of words, it had been a lack of honesty. He had been trying to play a character, and the character had broken. The real Julian, it turned out, spoke just fine.
The invitation had been sitting on Julian's kitchen table for 3 weeks. It was for the annual Design for the Future Gala, the same event, in the same hall where his life had changed 6 months ago. His first instinct had been to tear it up, but Marcus had insisted. "Go as a guest," Marcus had said. "Go and see it from the other side." Walking back into the auditorium felt like stepping into a cold pool. The smell of floor wax and the dim amber glow of the house lights triggered a familiar tightness in Julian's chest. He found his seat in the middle of the 10th row and sat down, his heart skipping a beat. He watched as the first speaker, a young woman in a sharp blazer, stepped toward the mahogany lectern. She looked confident, her slides flashing onto the screen with rhythmic precision. But then, halfway through her presentation, the remote jammed. The screen went black. The speaker froze. Julian felt a wave of empathy so strong it was almost physical. He saw her eyes widen, searching the dark room for a friendly face. He saw her hands start to tremble. The audience began to murmur, that same low hum of confusion he remembered so well. "Take a breath," Julian whispered to himself, wishing she could hear him. "It's just a screen." He realized then that he wasn't judging her. No one in the room was laughing. They were all rooting for her, waiting for her to find her way back. The monsters he thought he saw in the audience months ago weren't monsters at all. They were just people who wanted to be inspired. The speaker closed her eyes for a second, laughed nervously into the mic, and said, "Well, I guess the technology is telling me to get to the point." The audience laughed with her, not at her. She continued without the slides, her voice growing stronger as she spoke from the heart. Julian felt a massive weight lift off his shoulders. He had spent months thinking his failure was a tragedy that everyone remembered. In reality, it was just a human moment in a world full of them. He was no longer haunted by the silence. He was ready to stop being a ghost in the back of the room. He was ready to step up to the plate one more time.
The Highlands Library was finally finished. It wasn't a glass palace, and it hadn't won any international awards, but it stood solid against the mountain wind. On opening day, the town didn't hire a professional moderator or set up blinding spotlights. Instead, they placed a small battery-powered microphone on a wooden table in the middle of the new reading room. Julian stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the smell of fresh larch and the sight of children pulling books from the shelves. Mrs. Gable, the librarian, handed him the mic. "Your turn, Julian. Tell them how we got here." Julian took the microphone. It was light, plastic, and slightly warm from the sun. He looked at the crowd, maybe 50 people in total. There were the contractors he had worked with, local families, and Marcus, who was leaning against a bookshelf in the back. He didn't have a remote control. He didn't have a PowerPoint. He didn't even have a single note in his pocket. "I used to think that a building was just a set of perfect lines," Julian began. His voice wasn't thin anymore. It was grounded. "I thought if I followed the rules and said the right words, everything would stay in place. But I learned that the best structures and the best stories have to have room for the unexpected."
He paused, and for a second a flicker of the old fear returned. The room went quiet, but this time the silence didn't feel like a vacuum. It felt like an invitation. "This library isn't perfect," Julian continued, smiling. "If you look closely at the corner of the atrium, you'll see a small gap where the wood shifted during the first storm. We kept it that way to remind us that things change. We adapt. We keep our chins up." The applause that followed wasn't the polite, distant clapping of a gala. It was loud, personal, and warm. As Julian handed the mic back, he realized that the public failure hadn't been the end of his career. It had been the beginning of his character. He had lost a city contract, but he had found his voice. He wasn't the man who froze anymore. He was the man who had weathered the storm and built something beautiful from the wreckage. He walked toward the door, ready for the next project, knowing that even if the lights went out again, he would know exactly what to say.
Julian's story reminds us that failure isn't the opposite of success, it's a part of it. He lost his voice on a big stage, but he found a much stronger one in the silence that followed. We covered some powerful idioms today. Remember, whether you're drawing a blank in an English exam or learning to weather the storm in your career, the most important thing is to keep your chin up and keep practicing. Have you ever had a public failure moment? How did you handle the aftermath? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. It's a great way to practice your English writing. Revise all the new idioms in the description box, and don't forget to answer the question in the quiz section. If this story helped you, please give it a like and subscribe to Glisso for more real-life English stories. I'll see you in the next story. Keep learning and keep growing. Goodbye.